I'm Inez.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we have, as usual, a lineup of disparate topics for you today, all of them important. We're going to start by talking about the potential Israel-Hamas ceasefire. Will is going to cover that for us. I'm going to talk more about the response at home with the Hillcrest High School incident here at home in Queens. And then we're going to move to Ben, who's going to talk about Media Matters and Elon Musk and the potential lawsuit there. And then finally, Amber is going to round us out with Ireland's new hate speech bill with some seriously disturbing implications there. With that, I'll hand it over to Will to kick us off.
Thank you, Inez. So yes, if you've been paying attention to the news at all, there has been a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas for about the last 5 days, I want to say. Today is day 5 of the ceasefire. It was originally scheduled to be about 4 days long, with 13 Israelis released each day in exchange for something like 39 Palestinians, a 3-to-1 ratio, which is it's pretty dramatic. It's substantially better than the 1,000-to-1 ratio that Hamas managed to achieve back when Gilad Shalit was taken captive. So it's substantially better than that, probably because of the immense pressure that the Israeli military has been able to put on Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip. And this ceasefire apparently is going to continue as long as Hamas is willing to produce 10 live Israeli hostages each day. That also just kind of put a finite time limit on how long the ceasefire could last, because there's only 200 plus hostages in Gaza that are even possible for Hamas to release, and some of them aren't even in their control, as we're finding out. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects we can talk about. The first is this very bizarre circumstance that Israel finds itself in, where you have, a lot of people out there trying to talk about how humane Hamas has been to some of the hostages and how terrible Israel's been. And it's just, I tweeted out how Israel is just in these bizarre circumstance where they had, effectively the equivalent in America would be something like a Mexican drug cartel raiding El Paso, kidnapping toddlers, and then demanding that we release convicted drug cartel operatives in exchange for the toddlers, and 3 for 1, not just 1 for 1, but 3 for 1. It's actually, in some sense, I don't think America would agree to a ceasefire like this, even if it's, substantially better than the one that Israel agreed to 10 years ago. But there's definitely a contingent within Israel that is very, and understandably so, prioritizes getting the hostages home above prevailing in the military conflict. And I think Yoram Hazony's son, H.A. Hazony, had a very good thread sort of explaining the underlying logic of this that you can read on his feed. He explained that even though this was militarily unwise, and many in Israel understood that it was militarily unwise, part of the tribes of Israel, as he put it, a big chunk of the Israeli public very much prioritized getting the hostages back and went to war to get the hostages back. And to keep those people in the tent, to keep Israeli society unified, they needed to take a reasonable deal if it was on offer. So I think that's ultimately what the Israelis decided to do. I suspect also that given the way that the war has gone over the past 3 to 4 weeks, the Israeli military basically decided that they could tolerate an operational pause without suffering any major, weaknesses in their military position. And I think ultimately, I don't know how much longer this can go on. I suspect it'll go on for a few more days as Hamas is able to release all the remaining, some of the less valuable hostages. But eventually there will be some line drawn. I saw some reporting out there that Hamas was trying to negotiate more forcefully to exchange people who are members of the IDF, like actual military captives, that they wanted far more in return in terms of Palestinian prisoners to be released. There's a few other dynamics that are at play. There's the fact that there's this video that went around. I mean, immediately, almost as the ceasefire began, you had lynchings starting happening, and not in Gaza, but in the West Bank by Hamas. You had the lynching of 2 collaborators that went all over social media, and people out there filming it like they were at a Taylor Swift concert on their smartphones. Kind of really clarifies that maybe these aren't the good guys. They're still we're well past lynchings at this point, you would think. And I guess the final thing to take away here is you know that there's going to be continued pressure on Israel to launch a permanent ceasefire, and it seems like what I'm reading on Hamas is that they are trying to get a deal where they get a permanent end to the conflict in exchange for the release of all the hostages. I sincerely hope that nobody, I don't think Israel will go for that. I hope they don't go for it, and I hope the United States doesn't try and pressure them into it, because even if all the hostages are returned, that's not the end of the war. You still started this with a massacre that killed 1,400 civilians for no good reason, and it is still not a durable end to the conflict in a world where the organization that did that is just allowed to, kind of go back to the status quo ante and continue to rebuild. And so I hope that this ceasefire, I'm very happy for all the hostages that have been released and very happy for their families, and am not, certainly the more hostages that are released, the better. But I hope that Israel is able to recommence its military campaign and bring an end to Hamas sooner rather than later. But I'm interested to hear what you guys have to think.
Just a couple thoughts. One, it's really impossible to judge without knowing more about the military dynamics that you mentioned, Will. Like, I don't know what they're giving up operationally. One hopes that they know what they're giving up operationally, which is not as far from certain, either, that they know exactly what they're giving up operationally. But balancing these two goals that unfortunately are somewhat, if not in conflict with each other, at least in tension, just destruction of Hamas and their capabilities to carry out an October 7th every month, like they have promised publicly on TV, and getting the hostages back in one piece. One wishes that these two goals were not in conflict, of course, but they are. And so balancing those things, I think, requires way more knowledge that's just not public. So I'm reluctant to sort of comment on that balance. That being said, I think Will is right to say that maintaining support, especially outside of Israel in places like the United States and Western Europe, for the war will be really critical after the exchanges, if they are completed, after those exchanges are completed. I would not assume, especially domestically in Israel, that the public will not be even more worked up in terms of pursuing this just war after we learn more about what has happened to these people for these past weeks in Gaza. I just want to make one note, though, about the media coverage of these exchanges. I think nicely summarized by a beautiful cacophony of both idiocy and incredible sort of moral bias, right? In the Sky News interview, wherein the frankly idiotic anchor points to some expert, and it's very funny when she points to the expert saying this, because like even there she has to point to expertise, but essentially she accuses Israel of not placing equal value on the lives of Palestinians versus Israelis because they were willing to give 3 prisoners, convicted prisoners or prisoners waiting for trial, up for every Israeli hostage returned. It smacks of the 3/5 the idiot 3/5 argument, where you hear the left in this country argue that the Constitution only valued slave lives at 3/5 that of white lives at that time, when of course this was, in fact, if you valued slaves' lives at that time, you would want them counted as 0 in representation. Anyway, so that kind of moral idiocy was just really the capstone. But I just want to read a couple of the other headlines. In the AP, it said Palestinians rejoice over, quote, minors, women prisoners returned. You see again this equivalence between people who are snatched from their beds in these kibbutzes, and people who have been convicted many times of terrorism and murder being exchanged. I think the comparison to cartel members is a good one, Will. Reuters, Hamas releases 13 more Israeli soldiers, referring to the captives that were released. I mean, the ages of these people alone would show you that they're not soldiers. They're either children or women and men in their 70s and 80s. And then finally, the New York Times, of course, the inglorious profile on the, quote, disfigured woman who was released. Of course, she was disfigured in her own car bombing attempt, trying to take out the lives of Israeli civilians. Anyway, so I think it's worth noting, and it goes to the point, too, about maintaining the support after any potential hostage exchanges are complete. The media is going overboard and trying to morally equivocate between these two groups of people being exchanged.
There was a moment a few days ago where Congressman Greg Pence was confronted at a restaurant by pro-Palestinian protesters, and confronted is maybe not a strong enough word. He was harassed at a restaurant, which happens quite frequently to members of the political right, unfortunately. But they were, of course, demanding that he support a ceasefire. And he pointed out, well, there currently is a ceasefire, and Hamas is, this is contingent on Hamas continuing to release hostages. And they said, well, no, you have to support a permanent ceasefire. And he just replied and said, that's by definition not a ceasefire then, right? Like, that's the ending of the war. And so I think it just kind of spoke to the unrealistic and unjust expectations that the pro-Palestinian left has toward Israel. And it becomes quite obvious their bias in terms of how they have these very unequal expectations in this war where Israel is defending itself in response to a terror attack, in terms of what Israel is supposed to do in order to work toward peace versus what Hamas and Palestine is supposed to do.
So I may have to reserve some of my commentary here for parting shots, but I will say that I am dubious of this deal. Obviously, setting aside the certainly pressure that Benjamin Netanyahu was under, both domestically, certainly from the left, and perhaps to some extent from the right as well, and then from the Biden administration as well. It hasn't really been fully addressed yet to what extent the Biden administration forced this deal effectively on Benjamin Netanyahu, and how this fits into what this administration perceives to be U.S. national interest. But I think that the fact that this so-called deal, which is not just 3-for-1 in terms of, in some cases, convicted terrorists, but is also effectively the resupply of Hamas in terms of fuel and other aid going into Gaza, as well as, of course, the cessation in fighting when Hamas was getting pummeled. All of this serves to its interest, in addition to the fact that I think this has the real prospect of being 15 days to slow the spread, but for Hamas's survival. To what extent does the ceasefire continue extending, despite the fact, by the way, that there's ample evidence to suggest that Hamas has violated its terms, including before we came to record today, attacking with remote detonated weapons and members of the IDF? Does this extend? Does international pressure grow? What do the terms of an extension look like? And obviously, to what extent does it not only allow Hamas to resupply and regroup, but to change its positioning for Hamas members who have fled to southern Gaza to further hide among the population and prepare for potential staging of future attacks? So I think all of this is in question. And so for all the good, and it obviously is great that there are hostages, innocents, who have returned to their homes, in many cases under the most heartbreaking of circumstances, strategically and tactically, the goals of eradicating Hamas as well as releasing hostages here are at cross purposes based upon this method for returning the hostages as opposed to attacking and exfiltrating them.
With that, I guess I'll hand it to myself as moderator's prerogative. I want to talk about the Hillcrest High School incident. This is in Queens, in New York. There was a teacher who went on her own private time to one of the pro-Israel protests in the city and posted a picture of herself on her personal Facebook page holding a sign that said, "I stand with Israel." And there was a mass protest. I use protest in the mostly peaceful sense because sinks were ripped off the walls, tiles were broken, so there was a fair amount of not non-peaceful protesting, but students out into the corridors of the school, basically rampaging through the school, controlling the school. The police were able to arrive on the scene. They actually took the teacher, put her in a closet to try to separate her from the mob of students. And then, of course, this was all culminated by the students proudly posting their participation in this mini riot in the school on TikTok and elsewhere, to mostly cheers from their classmates. So this is a school, by the way, that is towards the bottom. It's in the bottom 40 of well over 500 schools in New York City in terms of math and reading scores. So that should give you a sense of how the school is performing on its primary duty. There have been some initially there were just some in-school suspensions under pressure of a school, has said they're going to increase the punishments, and that the police are now looking at, and they have arrested a couple of the students and may arrest more. The bottom line here, I think, is twofold. One, this sort of moral revolution within a generation and a half of Americans cannot be underestimated, and now can be deployed on any basis. I do not believe that a bunch of kids in Queens know, and as we know from some of the like sort of man on the street interviews that have been done, you know, they don't know which rivers they're talking about when they chant from the river to the sea, right? They don't know which sea and they don't know which river. They don't know much about this conflict at all. What we have is essentially a Red Guard that can be mobilized for basically any reason that gets ginned up, whether that's abroad or domestically, for any of the current thing protests that can be deployed in that way. And that is the result of the education system, of course, egged on by foreign adversaries on TikTok, et cetera. But it is fundamentally the result of decades of indoctrination, both in in universities, bleeding down into K-12. And it has resulted in a generation of Americans who are not just ignorant, but are very morally certain that Israel, America, and most importantly, I think actually maybe I should have said that the other way around, because it's the great Satan and the little Satan, right? That generally the West has gotten prosperous and free on the backs of the oppressed. And two, these are kids who are totally used to not having any consequences. Indeed, they're used to being rewarded for this kind of behavior, right? And because that has been the operative oppressor-oppressed construct, I think, as Amber said well last week on this podcast, right? That has been the construct applied to everything in their ideological world. And they've been rewarded for this in the past. If you are a member of the oppressed group and you say attack a teacher who is categorized alternatively as Jewish or white, interchangeably perhaps as Jewish or white, you are the oppressed group. You can do no moral wrong. Everything you do is excusable and indeed laudable. You know, this is the sort of thing that these kids in other contexts would be putting on their college applications and to be proud of. And they're surprised, I think, suddenly that there have been some consequences in this context. But we would be fools to imagine that this is limited to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or anything particular. I think this is an American Red Guard that can be deployed by the left on any number of subjects, as we saw in 2020. So with that, I'll kick it out to the group for thoughts.
I think it's also important to point out the language that these groups use, and particularly the groups of young people on the progressive left. I think building off of the idea of the oppressor versus oppressed class, which is that these individuals will frequently use, I would probably describe it as dehumanizing language and violent rhetoric. So, for example, when you hear the pro-Palestinian left talk about Israel, they use terms like genocide. They use phrases like committing war crimes without evidence. And this is very intentional. And they use this kind of language about the political right in America as well. And the reason they do that is because it justifies their own violence. It creates a paradigm where if they are behaving violently, they are merely doing so in self-defense because they are being actively marginalized or oppressed or genocided or whatever other term that they're using. We see this pretty consistently, for example, among Black Lives Matter protesters, where they claim that the police are out actively hunting Black men. And so for them to riot in the streets in response to George Floyd being killed, that's justified because they're simply protecting themselves from future violence. And that's, I think, an sort of not talked about portion of this ideology, but one that's incredibly important because even when we go back to the roots of Antifa, there was a Dartmouth professor back in, I believe it was 2016 or 2017, so pretty early in the Antifa days, where he was talking on CNN, no less, about how he believes that Antifa's violence is justified because they are merely responding to systemic violence or violence that is committed on behalf of the government's policies. And so that is very inextricably intertwined in this sort of leftist Marxist worldview that's been really heavily adopted by the youth.
have a quick point here. You'll see a lot of these administrators use language like how the actions of the students are intolerable or inexcusable or unacceptable, but their actions, these administrators' actions, don't match the words they use. Like they effectively say, okay, and as a result of this being unacceptable, we're going to do a training of some sort about anti-Semitism with no meaningful punishment. I'm sorry, like falsely imprisoning a teacher in her room and threatening her and demanding her expulsion. That's not behavior that requires a training. That's behavior that requires meaningful consequences for the students involved. And unless like schools are actually willing to impose consequences, meaningful consequences on this, riot-like behavior from their students, you're just going to see more of it. It's like, I don't know how we solve the algorithm problems. Obviously, those are, a problem of themselves, but certainly like schools, we should at least be trying to hold these administrators to their word. Like if they say that these things are unacceptable, they need to act like it's unacceptable.
I think this points to, in many ways, the sort of intractable problem, rather, that we discuss often on this show, which is that the schools are the breeding grounds for a self-perpetuating anti-cultural revolution. For decades, for generations, you have teachers who attend teaching colleges who themselves are effectively radicalized in the kind of Marxian dialectic, oppressed versus oppressor worldview. And here at this school in particular, you also have a student population that's been reported to be over 30% Muslim. And this fits with the idea that we've discussed before, certainly I've discussed before, of the prism of the left-wing worldview that, when looked at through the eyes of the Muslim world, and that includes abroad and at home, fit perfectly together in this sort of unholy alliance, which views the West as the oppressor par excellence. I won't repeat the Yasser Arafat quote for the millionth time, but where he's talking about the Palestinian cause, about liberation, it's about social justice, links those causes to other quote unquote social justice causes. And we're talking in the 1960s then. So this is what you get when you have intersectionality, and it continues to be imbibed in generation after generation. And you're probably going to start seeing it in younger and younger kids. And so how do you deal then with the problem of multi-generational brainwashing in a fundamentally anti-American, anti-Western worldview? And these kids are going to go to colleges and they're going to learn the same thing again. So these are problems that, are deep-seated. It obviously starts in homes and families, but if kids spend most of their waking hours socialized in and, frankly, indoctrinated in public schools where this is the view that's propagated, it's a recipe ultimately for pogroms, effectively, and analogs to what we saw in the BLM riots and the activation of these groups who work together in an intersectional alliance, essentially to, at the point of a gun or at the threat of violence, impose their worldview and have more than a heckler's veto ultimately on what U.S. policy should be. So this is a microcosm of a generational and nationwide problem that we face. I suspect it's only going to get worse. And the last just anecdotal point I'll make is when I was attending Columbia, and this was back in 2006 to 2010, a time when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was invited to campus, I witnessed Israel Apartheid Week on campus, which there are Israel Apartheid Weeks on campuses across the country. And all you had to do was look at the flyers put forth by the groups who were backing Israel Apartheid Week. And you saw it was the Muslim Student Association and other Students for Justice in Palestine, and then all the coterie of progressive groups on campus. That sort of personified or illustrated an alliance that's been building for decades and decades. And you see that at a place like Hillcrest High School now.
I'll just kick it right back to you, Ben, to talk about the Media Matters potential lawsuit that Elon is bringing.
Yep. So on an entirely unrelated matter, Elon Musk, or X rather, has brought suit against Media Matters, claiming that Media Matters defamed the social media platform and essentially tried to obliterate its business model through what appears to be, based upon X's analysis and attempts to check essentially X's work and Media Matters' work, kind of the ultimate algorithmic smear job or hatchet job that Media Matters engaged in. And of course, Media Matters, founded by David Brock, the Democrat so-called hitman operative, and funded by, among others, George Soros, of course, has always been invested in destroying and canceling conservative voices, canceling Fox News itself, and now it's applying it to X. So what did Media Matters do? According to this lawsuit, Media Matters essentially created a fake account to follow a bunch of fringe so-called white supremacist or fascist, Nazi-esque accounts, and then the accounts of all of the largest paid advertisers for X. Then, according to X's analysis and according to independent analysis as well, Media Matters then refreshed their feed repeatedly to try and generate pairings in this concocted feed of the dubious or discriminatory or bigoted content appearing right next to the ads of all of X's major advertisers. They then screenshot them essentially and created a report and publicized it, saying, look at X. This is a platform where you, Apple or Microsoft or IBM or Oracle, et cetera, your ads, paid ads, appear next to and essentially fund this horrible rhetoric and content. And thus, some of the biggest advertisers on X almost immediately thereafter pulled their paid advertisements from X. As X notes, paid ads from major corporations are comprise the bulk of the revenue streams for the company. So if you get paid advertisers to pull those ads, you kill X's business model and ultimately deplatform the platform itself. So Elon Musk wouldn't take this lying down. He went out and sued Media Matters again for defamation and these attempts to essentially fraudulently destroy the business by smearing it. And I think there are a couple of major points that are worth emphasizing here. One is obviously that Media Matters here is even more ambitious than when it tries to go after a single voice or even a single network. But this is about, and part and parcel of a coordinated effort, I think, to pursue Musk and seek to destroy X, because it's the sole major platform out there that at least is trying to restore a modicum of free and open discourse, with the caveats that there does still appear to be shadow banning. I think we all probably see odd behavior with our own accounts on the platform, and that it's no silver bullet and it's not a perfect platform. But nevertheless, on a relative basis, it is better than the others. And not only that, but of course, Musk himself has shown a heterodox worldview and shown that he can't be controlled. And he essentially bought what amounted to, based on the surveillance and censorship regime that's been exposed, effectively an intelligence asset and also an information warfare asset from of our ruling class. And he wrenched it out of the ruling class's hands. That's why X has to be destroyed. And that's why it's incumbent upon the likes of an Elon Musk to go out and engage in lawfare against those who would seek to destroy the business, to be aggressive against those who never expect aggression. They expect those who are attacked to be cowed into submission. And this also points to, I think, the broader motto that's been pioneered by less, overtly political vehicles like Media Matters, but the likes of NewsGuard, for example, or the Global Disinformation Index, who purport to be objective graders of the veracity of content and the journalistic standards of outlets, but then essentially create blacklists of outlets who don't produce content that comport with the purported standards of their reviewers. And this leads to advertisers then pulling their ads, or ad agencies refusing to run ads on those sites that get bad ratings, that get blacklisted. And overwhelmingly and almost uniformly, this ends up being more conservative news sources. So there's a concerted effort to destroy the business models that platform non-regime, essentially, content. This is part and parcel of that broader assault effectively on our speech and dissent in this country. And so I'd say kudos to Elon Musk for actively and aggressively going after those who are behind it and trying to expose the kind of sinister efforts. But there needs to be obviously a much broader and more widespread strategy of legislation and lawfare and public relations aimed at defunding and dismantling the broader censorship industrial complex, of which Media Matters now clearly plays a part. So curious what you all make of Musk and X going after Media Matters, and then this sort of broader assault by these smear merchants, essentially, on speech, particularly as we head into 2024.
Your point about NewsGuard is, and just the general sort of so-called misinformation community of media smear merchants is well taken. I am reminded of Facebook that actually pays fact checkers that are notoriously biased to the left to place flags on content that they believe is false, i.e. is too conservative for their liking. And that content then gets either removed from people's timelines or otherwise suppressed by Facebook's algorithm. So, and again, these people are paid to do this. So they have not only a ideological incentive, but also a monetary incentive to try to get rid of content that would offend their political sensitivities. And Media Matters, as part of this group, I think is probably one of the most evil, because they are so, and the way they're organized is so intentional and so insidious. They refer to the individuals who write these hit pieces as researchers, as if they are like, like college students who are looking at media content for a thesis, when really most of them actually came up through left-wing campus activism, were hired by Media Matters to become watchdogs, in a sense, of right-wing media personalities. And many of them are actually assigned to specific right-wing media personalities. They watch and consume everything the person says or writes or does on the internet, and will twist and manipulate and warp to try to destroy that person's life. They've done it to me multiple times, where they've tried to get me fired from multiple jobs. Were successful on one occasion. And there's just something about them that is so like almost demonic in the way that they operate. And so I'm so thrilled to see Elon Musk go after them, because they are probably, I think, the worst offender in terms of weaponizing their own platform to try to destroy the lives and cancel the speech of other people, not to mention the fact that the rest of the mainstream media treats them as if they are a legitimate news source, as opposed to a left-wing opposition research firm.
Yeah, Media Matters is an appalling and contemptible organization and deserves to be destroyed. And it looks like they've actually found a way potentially to make that happen for them. One of the things that happened in the Dominion lawsuits, and that I was warning people about, was, a lot of people have been playing fast and loose on the internet with facts for a long time. But when you decide to state falsehoods about a very wealthy company that does measurable financial damage to them, you are actually walking into the world where you're actually going to get hit with one of those defamation lawsuits. And I think that's what Media Matters did here. They've been playing fast and loose with insulting conservative personalities for a long time, but those defamation lawsuits can be challenging. But here they didn't just insult somebody. They, engaged in shenanigans and probably outright fraud in order to hurt a $20 billion, a $40 billion company, and hurt its advertising in measurable ways, right? They can, the company can say, these are the companies that pulled their advertising as a result. This is the money we would have made, but for your lies and your fraud. So I think Media Matters is about to pay a very, very serious judgment to X. I think they're, the X's case just on the, from the facts that are publicly available seems very, very strong. And I hope this leads to the end of Media Matters as an organization, because, everybody there deserves to be on the unemployment line.
Yeah, in a sense, Teal had a harder job going after Gawker, because it's actually our First Amendment protections are much stronger going after conservative media personalities or anybody who sort of engages in the rough and tumble of media. But as Will says, there are different standards for financially hurting companies. And I would point out that even though this is pretty novel, I wouldn't assume that this case is going to go in Elon Musk's favor. What I do think is they've put together a case that is quite likely, particularly in Texas, of hurdling that motion to dismiss standard and getting into discovery. And you know what? That could be almost as valuable as a judgment against Media Matters, could be what comes out in this kind of case in discovery that allows other actors to see fully what this organization has been doing for quite some time. So I would say, yes, of course, I'd like to see them bankrupted and destroyed by a judgment against them in terms of financial consequences, but I will settle for a complete exposure of their fraudulent business model and the lies that they have used to harm not just a lot of people, but of course the financial interests of any company that they've deemed has gone against their own very particular politics. That being said, let's transfer back to Amber to talk about what's going on in Ireland with hate speech laws.
Absolutely. So the riots in Dublin are quite fascinating, and I think every American should be watching this story because it not only hits on the issue of immigration and the mass migration of refugees, but also the issue of free speech and political organizing in response to these types of policies. So in Dublin, there was a stabbing where a reportedly Algerian immigrant, who is now a naturalized Irish citizen, has lived there for 20 years, stabbed 4 people, including 3 children. And this sparked the riots that took place in Dublin by a number of citizens. There were, I believe, hundreds of arrests in these riots. And the police commissioners, the National Police Commissioner's response to the riots was to refer to them as a hooligan faction driven by far-right ideology. And I think it's important to point out the context of why these people are rioting. And of course, no one condones riots or violence in response to political policies. But this was sort of a powder keg that was ready to ignite because Ireland has taken 6 times more Ukrainian refugees than Britain. Approximately 15 to 18% of the Irish population is now foreign-born, including about 3% of individuals who have only moved to Ireland in the last year. And there's been concerns in Ireland, like there are throughout much of Europe, especially the UK, of the ability of some of these migrants and refugees to assimilate into the popular culture. And so this stabbing incident was seen as evidence, perhaps, that some cultural groups, when migrated en masse to other cultures, may create situations of violence and situations of unrest, in situations where there's not assimilation happening. It's also key here, I think, to understand that there is a lot of sentiment among the Irish populace that their economic fortunes are quite poor right now. This mass migration has led to a massive increase in housing prices. The rents in Ireland, especially in Dublin, have gotten really out of control. There's record homelessness. And yet the migrants who are being brought in by the Irish government are given priority on housing where the Irish citizens are not. So this was really the backdrop for these riots that took place in response to this stabbing, where the individual who committed the stabbing, by the way, the suspect, was stopped by passerbys. He wasn't stopped by police. He was stopped by heroes who took him down and were able to subdue him. Now, in response to the riots, and particularly the police commissioner referring to this as a hooligan faction driven by far-right ideology, UFC fighter Conor McGregor tweeted, "Innocent children ruthlessly stabbed by a mentally deranged non-national in Dublin, Ireland today. Our chief of police had this to say: not good enough. There is grave danger among us in Ireland that should never be here in the first place, and there has been zero action done to support the public in any way." He also said that he does not condone the riots or any attacks on first responders in their line of duty, but he understands the frustration of the protesters. Well, there are now reports that Conor McGregor is actually being investigated for violating Ireland's hate speech laws because they viewed his tweets as an incitement of violence and an incitement of the riots. So even criticizing the current policies and the government's response to the political situation that has helped inspire and spark these riots is deemed unacceptable by the Irish government. And there's also more hate speech laws being proposed in Ireland that would criminalize not just actual speech, but the possession of speech. So for example, if you had a reckless meme on your phone or were otherwise in possession of speech that was deemed objectionable by the Irish government or by a judge, you could be criminalized for that under these proposed new laws. So instead of taking seriously the concerns of their citizens, the Irish government has decided to instead crack down on their ability to speak against it and try to control and subjugate the naturalized and Irish-born citizens who have a problem with the way that their country is being run. And I think that is perhaps a warning to what could potentially happen here in the United States as we face a very similar migrant crisis right now.
A couple thoughts on this. One, every time one of these cases props up about hate speech laws, I am reminded and grateful for how different American First Amendment law is, even from countries that we consider free Western countries, like, it's similar in the UK as it is in Ireland. Certainly in France, for example, there are far fewer speech and religious liberty protections than there are in the United States. So every time I'm grateful. I mean, it's worth pointing out how far this law goes. As Amber said, it criminalizes the possession of materials that are, quote, likely to incite violence or hatred. That's a completely ambiguous standard, right? They define that as, quote, hatred against a person or group of persons in the state or elsewhere on account of their protected characteristics, including national origin. And so, like, they're including gender, right? All the usual suspects, but national origin, right? Like, so effectively, potentially, this law could criminalize any discussion of the immigration policy in Ireland. Now, I realize that, again, other countries have different standards. I'm not actually feeling particularly sympathetic to the Irish over this, considering that they so strongly support this kind of terrorist activity in Israel now. They have such strong alignment for the Palestinians who are doing the same things as the guy who stabbed people in Ireland, and they seem to be unable to reconcile these two things. That being said, I mean, the latitude, again, just every time one of these stories pops up, I find myself so grateful for the particular legal structure of the U.S. Constitution, that despite we obviously have people we just discussed in the last segment of Media Matters, right, about Media Matters and elsewhere, we have all the same instincts. We have a very powerful left with all the same instincts, and yet, as bad as things are, and I know that this is not a cheerful podcast, and every week we are telling you how bad things are, the First Amendment has proven to be a very valuable barrier. The fact that they've had to go around the First Amendment between this kind of private censorship, public-private regime that, again, we've discussed many times in the Missouri v. Biden case, right, is because they can't directly criminalize this kind of speech the way that Ireland is free to, it seems happy to, the way that the UK has already done, and the way that France does regularly. So for that, I'm just feeling particularly grateful this week for our founding fathers and for the framing of the Bill of Rights. In this case, it really does matter. It has put a real barrier up to exactly this kind of behavior in the United States.
Yeah, I'll be again pretty brief here. Ireland spent very many years trying to fight for their independence from the United Kingdom, in many ways very violently and with the use of terrorism, and they finally achieved it, only to now be in a situation where they're treating basic political speech as the equivalent of child pornography. Like, if you're in possession of something like the Daily Wire's new movie, that's probably hate speech and sufficient to get you punished under this new law if the government so chooses. I'm heartened to see Conor McGregor stepping into the breach here and taking the right side of this conflict. And governments that do this stop looking like governments that, to me, and more like regimes that are deserving of regime change. So, we don't usually talk about regime change for European countries, but perhaps we should. Regime change for Ireland and install Conor McGregor as the rightful king. I think that might be a good thing for, and the next Republican administration to consider if, they're bored with everything else going on in foreign policy.
Yeah, so I guess if we have Milei in Argentina and Geert Wilders in the Dutch world, then maybe McGregor in Ireland. I will say, it's just striking to me always that essentially the instinctive response across the West now among the ruling class writ large is we institute a policy that leads to detrimental outcomes for the public. And then the response is, let's silence the public when it expresses its discontent about those policies. And it wants to speak openly and honestly about them and debate them forthrightly, as opposed to the ruling class imposing the policies on the public. And it just speaks to the weakness and ultimately the fragility of the system broadly in the West, that there has to be this constant and perpetual assault on speech. I agree with Inez. We're the best grading on a curve in the West in terms of our devotion to and adherence to free speech. And obviously, doctrinally, it is there, baked into law, baked in, obviously, to the First Amendment. How much of a dead letter that is obviously open to question and open to interpretation. The notion of memes, for example, being an issue, as we've discussed before, you can now go to jail over a meme if it, I guess, is making fun of a protected Democrat figure like Hillary Clinton. I understand that in many of the January 6th cases, investigators look to people's memes on social media essentially to frame them as, I guess, propagating in or trafficking in wrongthink, that there can be some nexus of to what occurred on January 6th. So this is the brave new world that we've entered. It's worth looking at where European countries are coming down in terms of their assaults on free speech, probably to anticipate where our authorities will go next when they move on and beyond dis, and malinformation, or the imperative to defend quote unquote critical infrastructure, to whatever the next pretext is for seeking to silence their critics.
And with that, we're going to move to final thoughts, and to avoid the usual long silence, I'll just kick it off. Obviously, I agree with everything that Ben just said. I hope that I did not come off as downplaying the danger to speech in America, which I think is dire. I only think legally it's more difficult here, and we should be grateful for that. The fact that our nefarious actors have to perform more dancing steps to try to get around is actually an important difference between the Constitution and even the law of the land in, again, countries that we consider free and Western countries that generally support free speech. I actually have kind of a framing question, and I'm wondering maybe some of you will jump in on final thoughts. I think it's about time to start assessing what the successes and failures of 9 years of populist backlash to a set of policies, chief among them that we were discussing, right? Immigration policy, but including many others set by elites that are clearly out of touch by a wide margin with what their populations see around them and vote for. And I would just throw out that I think it's a quite depressing assessment now. We have since 2016, if we take Donald Trump's election, right? We have at least 9 years of this. We had Trump's election, we had Brexit, we had Meloni in Ireland. In Italy, we had now Geert Wilders so like we've had all of these like sort of backlash from the population, and yet even just taking immigration as the one example. As far as I can tell, basically there has been no major change conducted on any of the basic immigration policy of any one of these countries. In Europe, that might be because of the superstructure of the EU and the incentives that are and restrictions that are in place there. In the US, it's because Congress is essentially a sclerotic institution, and there's only so much an administration, even like Donald Trump, attempted to enforce some of the law, but the law itself in the United States is set up, particularly with a series of court cases, is set up to basically more or less maintain this kind of flow across our southern border. So even if you shrink it just down to immigration, I think there's a quite depressing assessment to be made as to whether these kinds of populist backlashes and elections have actually substantially changed the trajectory, even on this one issue. We are 9 years in. It's not just started happening. It's very clear that there is such a huge gap between the population and the ruling elites of all of these countries on issues like immigration. But so far, no one has really been able to break through and substantially change even something that seems so obviously within the sovereign power of a nation state, right? As deciding who is coming into their borders and who isn't. So that's kind of a depressing final thought, I admit, but that's my final thought.
Yeah, we haven't had really durable change in the United States from the populist revolution. I think, there's a reason I went down to Florida to work for a guy who's currently running for president. I don't work for him anymore, but I came down here for a reason. That's precisely because he's the guy who we've actually seen real durable changes made in Florida to the way things work here within the authority that he has. It's a reminder that you actually need to be good at governing, that it's not merely enough to have anger and rage, because anger and rage dissipates. Like, you actually have to have somebody who believes in the policy and has the understanding of the law to implement it. One long-term thesis I had, especially after watching what happened during the Trump administration and the many ways in which he was tripped up by the bureaucracy and the courts, was we need a president who's a lawyer. Most people don't say that. They think, oh, we need a president who's a businessman. We need a president who can make deals. There are no deals to be made. The question is not, how do we get a deal with Congress to get what we want done? The question is, how do we get somebody who understands how to use the laws already on the books to enact the change that we need implemented? And, that's one of the many cases that I think there is for Governor DeSantis as president. And I still believe it. And I think, just as a side note, like, don't count that guy out. And he really is the guy that could implement the agenda we want to see implemented here in the States.
So I'll be brief, and on the kind of limits of, or what we should make of, the kind of populist revolt, ongoing populist revolt throughout the Western world. It's obviously a mixed bag on a state by state, nation by nation basis. How effective the backlash has been at both electing leaders with a shared agenda and then their success in actually effectuating and implementing it. I think measured by, for example, in the US, how skeptical people are of authorities and institutions broadly in this country, you'd say that's probably a win to some extent in terms of how distrustful on the merits people are of ruling elites that have ultimately, I think we'd all agree, lied to us, undermined our national interest, and ultimately worked at cross purposes to the common good of our society. Obviously, the follow through and then the execution is more than open debate. And I think in part, what that speaks to is just the size, influence, and power of the forces that you're up against almost definitionally in a populist movement, even beyond, of course, the splintering that you have in any kind of political movement, the ambitions of those who seek to lead it, and how they may undermine the movement itself in jockeying for power. But obviously, you're up against every major influential and powerful institution because the agenda that's been imposed is one that they view as in their self-interest. So effectuating revolutionary change takes time, effort. It's a difficult thing. On the other hand, I don't think that there's any alternative to it long term. So even if it's a losing proposition to be in 9 years into this project to challenge institutions captured by those who have a fundamentally different and in some cases antithetical worldview to our own, there's no alternative but to keep plugging away at it and trying. And just as it took generations for this kind of Gramscian long march to triumph, it'll probably take generations to try and reverse the damage done and replace the institutions with something better. So it's still a work in progress, obviously. It's an uphill battle, but I don't think there's any alternative but to engage in it.
I agree with Ben. I think that's a really great perspective, is to keep plugging away. As much as, electing Donald Trump was a real kick in the butt for a large swath of our institutions, and as good as it felt for, I think, the underrepresented people in America, there's only so much you can do in the American political system with merely an executive who is championing certain policies. And specifically on the immigration question, I mean, I think Trump was fantastic on the issue for the most part. He was able to implement a lot of change using executive powers, from the Remain in Mexico policy to negotiating a deal with Mexico such that they would use their own National Guard to help patrol the southern border. He had the safe third country rule. He had the rule where he would prosecute every illegal crosser and keep them in custody as opposed to catch and release. So there were a lot of great changes that were made. Unfortunately, because of our political system, of course, those were immediately undone by the new administration, by President Joe Biden. And so Congress is a huge roadblock, as Inez said. But I am, I guess, hopeful and optimistic that we have been also seeing more candidates crop up that are of a populist persuasion, whether it's people like J.D. Vance being elected to the Senate, Josh Hawley from Missouri. We have Blake Masters running again for Congress in Arizona. We continue to see more and more of these type of people who are actually willing to listen to popular sentiment running for office, and it's going to take a long time, and it might fail ultimately. But as Ben said, I think that's the only option.
On that note, relatively hopeful one for us. On behalf of Will, Ben, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.